All right, everybody, welcome back to Contemporary American Literature. This will be our last lecture for the week focused on some of the writings coming out of the social movements of the 1960s. Though this last lecture on Ishmael Reed and his Neo-Hoodoo Manifesto, I really intend to be sort of a transitional lecture. It's moving into the next week, or really the next 2 weeks, when I want to think about how the social movements of the 1960s transformed literature in the long run by moving toward a multicultural and diverse perspective, and some of the ways that literature was transformed. Also, some of the this wasn't like one smooth movement where everybody agreed. Some of the differences and divergences that were within these set of developments. So that's what I want to look at next week and the week after. And I think Ishmael Reed is a good place to begin. So Ishmael Reed was born in 1938, another 30s birth. Remember, we're charting 30s births, in Chattanooga, Tennessee, before his parents relocated to Buffalo, New York, in that early 20th century period of the Great Migration, when a lot of African American communities were leaving the South, which was heavily legally segregated, and leaving the rural South largely for the urban North to pursue not only an escape from that legal form of oppression, because while there was plenty of racism in the North, there weren't the same strict kind of segregation laws that there were in the South under the Jim Crow era, and also for economic opportunity, as the North is the more industrial center, so there's more job opportunities. So his parents relocated at that time, and he attended the University of Buffalo but left without taking a degree, and then after spent some time in New York City before he moved to California to teach at UC Berkeley, which is where I think Joan Didion went to college and where Philip K. Dick briefly went to college. So Reed, I think, is also a great example of somebody who exemplifies this sort of West Coast shift that we're seeing in the 60s as well, because he starts out on the East Coast but then moves west, and all of his literary activities since then, and he's still very active literarily, still writing and still posting to social media and things, are centered around particularly Oakland, California, and its diverse populations. So Reed is a writer in multiple genres. He writes fiction, poetry, and nonfiction. He's probably best known for his novels, which are generally considered postmodern novels, particularly the 1972 book Mumbo Jumbo, which is generally considered his most famous book. And they are very postmodern in certain ways. They're very postmodern in that they break down that high-low barrier. He's very interested in writing in modes like detective fiction and Western fiction, science fiction and fantasy. Well, not so much science fiction, but all these other sort of popular modes. And he's interested in comic books. He's interested in jazz and other forms of popular music. And he's really wants to bring these forms of popular culture to the fore in kind of experimental literary structures that are very non-linear, very meta, very self-reflexive upon themselves as fictions. So in that way, he's a very postmodern writer in the techniques he uses and in the breakdown of the barrier between high and low culture. And he expresses this in his fiction, but he also writes poetry, nonfiction. And the work we're going to read by him is kind of a hybrid work. He published it in a volume of poems, but it doesn't look like poetry. It's written in prose, so it's kind of a prose poem, but he calls it a manifesto, which is a form we've already encountered in this class, this kind of assertion of belief and value. It's another kind of important non-fictional form, along with the kind of journalism we were looking at with Joan Didion and some of the personal writing, the memoirs we'll be seeing later on. So he writes in multiple genres. And I think the way in which I would say he's not so postmodern is that his view isn't so much that we can't ultimately know anything, and so that the future is this open field of possibility that we saw in writers like Paley and Le Guin. And we also saw in Didion how that can become a very conservative view, that we live in this radical uncertainty, and so we need to fall back on individualism accompanied by strict traditions. His view is more complicated than that and more psychedelic than that. His view is that there's this long suppressed tradition of a kind of mental and spiritual liberty that is mainly, but not in any way exclusively, associated with Africa and with black people. And so he is trying to recover in his work this lost tradition, which he thinks only expresses itself in underground forms, in forms that are scorned by the European dominated global elite, who, and well, it's not even European. He's a little more far-reaching than this. By the enemy here for him is, as we'll see, monotheism, and so there's this suppressed tradition of liberty and freedom and communal joy and communal expressiveness that for him has been driven underground. And this is what he's trying to recover and bring about in his writing. So it's not really that the world is radically uncertain and we can never know anything. I think he's sure that this tradition exists, and it's a good tradition, and it goes all the way back really to the dawn of humanity, and we should try to recover it. But the tradition itself is kind of open-minded and freer and more fun than the tradition of monotheism that he sees as having shut it down. So that's his overall worldview. So he's postmodern in technique, but I don't know if he's fully postmodern. If postmodernism implies this complete inability to know, this complete chaos of the world, then I don't know if he's postmodern in that way. And I think that is something we're going to see in the multicultural movement. And we got a glimpse of that in Lucille Clifton, too. Remember Lucille Clifton's mother telling her, "You're from Dahomey women." So there was this African tradition that she embodied. So postmodernism maybe clears the ground of oppressive power structures for writers like Clifton or Reed, or Adrian Rich, who says, I want to investigate the wreck of history and see what the damage was done, but see what treasures prevail, what suppressed traditions there have been. So postmodernism might be useful as a negative thing to clear the ground of oppressive norms and power structures that were the grand narratives of modernity, which tended to be European, white-identified modernity. But then once the ground is cleared, you can begin to rebuild stable structures that are based on the traditions that those oppressive norms have clamped down on. So that's where I would say Reed falls on the postmodern to non-postmodern spectrum. And we're going to see similar things as we look at the writers next week that we're going to read. So Reed has also been active as a publisher and editor, and he particularly was interested in, doing small press publishing. He founded a grant-giving organization called the Before Columbus Foundation, the title of which, Before Columbus, there is a window into his worldview too, because that comes from a book called They Came Before Columbus by a writer named Ivan de Sertima. And the argument of that book, very controversial argument in the fields of, in the academic fields it touches on, is that before Europeans came to this hemisphere, there had been contact and influence and diffusion of African cultures in particularly South and Central American indigenous cultures. And so it's a view essentially that that once you clear your mind of the grand narrative of the European conquest of the world over the last half millennium, what you would find is that the non-European peoples of the world have been in harmonious contact with each other before that. Now, scholars in the field of Mesoamerican studies, as far as I know, aren't actually very convinced of this. They think it's a theory that doesn't hold up to the evidence. So I don't know. This is not a class in that topic, and I do not have training on those matters. So I can't tell you about that. But what I can tell you is that Reed, it goes along with Reed's general worldview, as we'll see in the Neo-Hoodoo Manifesto. So he names this grant-giving foundation because what he was trying to do was get around corporate publishing, which he saw as too white-dominated, and publish a much more diverse roster of poets and fiction writers and dramatists, and he did that, and he wasn't. It wasn't so much that he didn't publish white writers either, and it wasn't so much that he focused on black writers. He published a very wide spectrum of writers, whether they were African American, Asian American, Mexican American, etc. And he did publish white writers, but he was very interested in them sort of disaffiliating from the idea of being white. He was more interested in, well, what are your suppressed traditions? What are you, Italian American, Irish American? He thinks that the world has this rich tapestry of cultural plurality, but though running through it is this conflict that we'll see in the Neo-Hoodoo Manifesto between this more liberatory thing you don't quite have a name for that he calls Neo-Hoodoo, and then there's this oppressive, linear, monotheist grand narrative that's trying to clamp it down. But he sees this kind of running through all culture. So he was interested as a publisher in cultural pluralism in this way. So his message, say the Norton editors in their bio of him, his message is that a rich culture, an original culture, exists within the very forms that older European standards disallow as lowbrow. And so this is what he wanted to promote in his role as editor and publisher, all of these suppressed traditions, even the ones that exist within Europe itself. Now, Ishmael Reed is a controversial writer in a lot of ways. And so he doesn't, his writing is nothing like Philip Roth's, but a little like Philip Roth. I think there's this interest throughout his career in wanting to be a little bit provocative and wanting to provoke people, to upset people a little bit, to unsettle people's expectations. So he's controversial for some of his views. He's can often be quite skeptical of the women's movement, of feminism in many of its forms. I think a lot of the things that he said was that feminism was this way for the dominant white culture to break up minority communities by, I don't know if he'd put it this way, but maybe a blunt way to put it is by turning the women of minority communities against the men of minority communities. And he was quite judgmental about black female writers who wrote about the ways in which they were oppressed as women within the black community, for instance. And so he had this very skeptical view of feminism, though he says he's not a sexist or a misogynist. And there's even an aside in the Neo-Hoodoo Manifesto where he says, women will be treated with respect and as intellectuals and as our equals in this culture. It's just that he thinks that feminism as it's practiced in the white-dominated culture of the United States has this effect of disarticulating black communities or Asian communities or Hispanic communities, and sort of in that way, the white power structure adopts feminism to sort of put off changes to itself that are being called for by minority communities. But that's a controversial view, and sometimes he's expressed it in ways that were questionable, and I'll just let you look that up. Also, he is hostile to monotheism, in all its manifestations. You probably noticed in the Neo-Hoodoo Manifesto that he's very harsh about Christianity. He's very harsh about Islam. He doesn't mention Judaism in this one, but he can be harsh about that in other of his writings. And so this, blanket dismissal of the monotheistic, he calls monotheism an ugh religion, like ugh. Like it grosses him out. And so this blanket dismissal of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, these vast world religions that and by the way, it's kind of a minority position to take this view within the African American community, within it's not, let's just say it's a controversial view to dismiss in a very harsh way these big religions that so many people have some allegiance or attachment to, and some of the ways in which he expressed this distaste have provoked the ire of people. And more recently, and this is maybe a slightly more fun topic, is he hates Hamilton, the musical Hamilton, and he wrote a play that was a counter to Hamilton because he thinks Hamilton is disgusting in the way that it portrays he doesn't like the way that it has actors of color portraying white people who were participating in slavery and using African American cultural forms like hip hop to portray these figures who he thinks were these slave trading white elitists. It's a kind of laundering their character. So he hates Hamilton and has been very vocal about criticizing it and wrote a play to criticize it. And I mean, I mentioned it's a fun topic because he wrote a play to criticize this play, but his critique is fairly serious. I've never seen Hamilton, by the way, all the way through or anything. I've just heard some songs and stuff. But it's a serious critique, actually. I think it's worth taking quite seriously, this idea of what is the gesture being made here to reconceive the founders, including some of their complicity in things like slavery, in these terms that make them more appealing in the present? Is this not a kind of cultural manipulation? So his hatred of Hamilton, while a kind of interesting sort of media topic, has at its core a very serious political critique, and I would urge you to maybe look into that as well. So let's look at his Neo-Hoodoo Manifesto and what it is that he seems to be calling for, because a manifesto is a statement of values. It's a statement of a kind of program. So what is Reed's program? So first of all, I don't even know if they tell you this in the Norton Hoodoo, is essentially a form of a kind of version of West African religions as it gets taken up in the Americas in the period of slavery. So hoodoo, and it's related to, and so I think hoodoo refers to its manifestations in North America, and then you have voodoo, which is in the Caribbean, particularly centered on Haiti. And so these essentially are underground forms of West African spiritual belief and practice. And they were driven underground, and they were more or less outlawed in the period of slavery. So what he is calling for is a renaissance of this hoodoo, this magical worldview. Magical in the sense that it's a kind of dynamic interaction with reality to bring about certain effects. So it's not like, so one of the differences between this and the monotheist worldview is in the general hoodoo worldview, sort of all of life and all of nature are alive and we can participate with them. Sort of the divine is in all things. And I suggested that was maybe one of the worldviews underlying Lucille Clifton's poem, Blessing the Boats, as opposed to a monotheist worldview where there's God, and God is above, God is transcendent, God is far away, and he sort of issues these commands that are for moral behavior that tend to be hostile to our physical nature. They tend to be hostile to nature itself. In a lot of ways, Reed is echoing Le Guin in She Unnames Them, where Le Guin sees, man naming the animals as the beginning of this illegitimate patriarchal authority over the earth. I think Reed would agree and give it the further inflection that this is very much a kind of European-centered worldview, that Christianity is this, the religion par excellence of, to put it bluntly, the white man, and so in that way is oppressive. So we have with Le Guin and Reed this parallel desire to take this conflict back. It's not just a political conflict. It's not like, oh, we need to change how women or how black people are regarded in the law. It's like, no, if women are oppressed as women, if black people are oppressed as black people, that goes all the way back to the essential ways in which Western society is organized from the level of its religion up. And so we need to challenge those religious structures. And as I said, that can be very controversial. That can be very provocative. And it's not as if, a lot of African Americans aren't Christian. It's not as if plenty of women aren't Christian. It's not as if plenty of people in the world aren't Muslims, you know? So when you start challenging these world religions, it gets to be a controversial thing. And so I understand that this could give offense, just as some of the other things we've read in this course could give offense. But I want to think through his logic. And I'm by the way, not endorsing anything. We do. This is not new journalism, as Joan Didion purports. We have objectivity here. So I'm just trying to tell you what have been the influential currents in American literature. So anyway, let's read a little of his writing. Hoodoo is the strange and beautiful fits the black slave Tituba gave the children of Salem. So in the Salem witch trials, when many women were burned, or I don't know if they were burned, actually were executed as witches, and they were what was the symptom of their being witches? Well, they would dance, or they would be sexually expressive. And Tituba, who is this black woman who was enslaved in the Puritan community in Salem, was often implicated in these documents. So Reed is saying this fear that black people introduce into America some kind of disruptive sexualized culture goes all the way back to the Puritans. And he's saying, notice what he's not saying, though. He's not saying that's a lie, that's a cruel stereotype, that's not true, which is one way you could have a fighting racial stereotyping. He says, no, it's not. It's true and it's good. Yes, that's what African Americans are doing, says Reed, and it's a good thing because we're trying to liberate this culture from the hang-ups it has from this patriarchal white monotheism. So he says, the reason that hoodoo isn't given the credit it deserves in influencing American culture is because the students of that culture, both overground and underground, are uptight, closet Jehovah revisionists. They would assert the American and East Indian and Chinese thing before they would the black thing. So Reed is saying that American popular culture is influenced through and through by this submerged, largely black tradition of a kind of spiritual, magical, bodily oriented, sexually liberatory culture that it has repressed. And it will do anything to deny that it is influenced by black culture in this way. It will say that America is white. It will. And here, again, he doesn't shy away from controversy because he's looking in the 50s and the 60s at the way the Beats and the hippies are influenced by Zen Buddhism and by various forms of Hindu religion, and they're turning to these Eastern religions, and he says they'll even turn to Eastern religion before they will admit. So they're so bent on denying black culture that they will turn to other cultures in over it. They'll even get away from this idea that they're monolithically white, but they'll turn to the cultures of other people of color because their main form of racism is hating black people. That is Reed's diagnosis here. And he says further on, in Theodore Roszak's book, The Making of a Counterculture, there is barely any mention of the black influence on this culture, even though its members dress like blacks, talk like blacks, walk like blacks, gesture like blacks, wear afros, and indulge in black music and dance, neo-hoodoo. And who's he critiquing here? He's critiquing people we've seen. He's critiquing the Beats, he's critiquing Ginsberg, he's critiquing Kerouac, I don't know if he would critique Pynchon, because I think Pynchon is much more open about the black influence in his work. But nevertheless, he's saying that all of these white counterculture movements are the thing that makes them counter to the dominant culture is they've taken up these black influences, but they don't own up to it, or they don't say that's what they're doing. So it's not so much, I think, for him that it's a criticism of cultural appropriation. I think he thinks that the black culture is genuinely better, and he doesn't blame anybody if they want to adopt it. So it's not that. It's not that they shouldn't take it up. The problem is that they take it up without acknowledgement that that's what they're doing, without a commitment to fighting racism, without any, and without really gratitude that they've been sort of liberated from their stultifying culture by one that he thinks is superior. So we have this critique here, but he says it's a very open philosophy, Neo-Hoodoo. Neo-Hoodoo believes that every man is an artist and every artist a priest. You can bring your own creative ideas to Neo-Hoodoo. So it's a pluralist, open culture. He thinks it kind of originates in black culture, but it can take on influences from other cultures. You could bring your own traditions. You can integrate your own traditions. He's not trying to set up something that's new and exclusive. And he says, the enemy, he calls Christ the landlord deity. So he associates Jesus with the landlord deity. Later on, we're going to see he calls the God of monotheism, what is it? It's on the next page. The cop God. So monotheism is this religion of hierarchy, of ownership, of policing. It's very rigid. It's not pluralistic. It's not open. It's a cop religion. It's a landlord religion. But notice he draws these metaphors from everyday urban experience of the oppression of African Americans who are hounded by the rent from their landlords, who probably don't live on site and aren't taking care of the property. They're policed by these cops who are largely a white police force that are, might be racist. So he draws these metaphors, but he applies them to the whole tradition of monotheism. And he says Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Christ, holds an honorary degree from Neo-Hoodoo. So, betraying Christ, betraying the God of monotheism is what you want to do. So he calls God a cop God, and he says Jehovah is the God of punishment. The H-bomb is a typical Jehovah miracle. Jehovah is why we are in Vietnam. So again, similar to Le Guin, the origin of all the problems that the movements of the 60s are protesting against, the sexism, the racism, the militarism, the imperialism, he locates at the heart of Western religion. And again, I want to say, that's not the only way to think about it. That's certainly not the way, for instance, Martin Luther King, a Christian minister, thought about it. So there are many different ways to think about this. But for writers like Reed and like Le Guin, you have to take the fight all the way back to the institution of Western culture in monotheism if you want to fight its local manifestations like sexist husbands or racist police officers or an oppressive war in the middle of the 1960s. And then the other thing I want to point out, this is the last thing I want to point out about the Neo-Hoodoo Manifesto, because a manifesto is generally, gives you a political program of action. So what is it that Reed says we should do? He says, political leaders are merely altar boys from Jehovah. While the targets of some revolutionaries are laundromats and candy stores, Neo-Hoodoo targets are TV, the museums, the symphony halls and churches, art, music, and literature departments in Christianizing, education I think they call it, universities, which propagate the art of Jehovah. Then go down a little bit. Many white revolutionaries can only get together with third world people, so the peoples from what we would now call the global south, on the most mundane political level because they are of Jehovah's party and don't know it. How much black music do so-called revolutionary underground radio stations play? On the other hand, how much Bach? So his point there, and this is very interesting and I think very much in line with the postmodernism we've been looking at. He says, he turns from politics. He says politics with a capital P, political parties influencing the government, staging a revolution. This is all surface level and it's not important. Obviously it's important, but it's not the main thing. The main thing is to change culture. The main thing is to change people's language, people's music, people's art, and that's how you make change. And so he says Neo-Hoodoo's targets are TV, museums, symphony halls, churches, and the humanities departments of the schools. We're going to change culture to change our society. You can't change politics and economics first, because first you have to change the way people think. And he says these white revolutionaries, the white counterculture, is not really useful to him because they don't admit how influenced by black culture they are, or maybe they aren't influenced by it enough. And notice he says, Bach, the classical musician, the classical composer, he says Bach should be demoted in favor of black popular music. And how many white revolutionaries are willing to do that? So that's very similar to Ursula K. Le Guin saying we need to change language to change society. And that, I think, puts Reed very much in that new left position of getting away from the old left. And he's very openly critical of Marxism. He thinks Marxism is just an offshoot of monotheism. And he thinks it's basically contemptible. So he's very critical of that. That puts him in the new left of wanting to change society, not by changing its economic or political structures, but by changing its cultural attitudes. And so in that way, his literature is this weapon in this political and ultimately, for him, religious struggle. So that is Ishmael Reed. And that will end today's lecture. So thank you and have a great day.